We are very happy that Senator Rand Paul, the three-term senator from the state of Kentucky and a medical doctor, has become a frequent and even you could say regular guest on our show. He was just on our show a couple of weeks ago to talk about the hearings where Dr. Fauci appeared, and we also sat down with him a little bit earlier today where we interviewed him about a wide range of issues regarding what is the seemingly bipartisan resistance to really having a serious investigation to simply review what was done with the COVID pandemic. It's something that we regularly do when we have major political controversies, the JFK assassination, the 9/11 attack, even the January 6th riot, which was of far less significance than these other events, including the COVID pandemic, all got these sort of bipartisan blue ribbon commissions to issue what was supposed to be the definitive report about what happened. Oftentimes we don't get the full story, but at least a recognition that these events deserve that kind of investigative attention, and yet none of that has happened when it comes to the COVID pandemic, even though arguably it is the single most significant and consequential event in our lifetime. And one of the few voices in Washington who has been relentless and continuing to pursue the truth about what was done with regard to COVID policy, what was done with regard to claims about its origin, whether the U.S. was involved through funding and other support into research that manipulated the coronavirus and made it more dangerous and more contagious and then it escaped. All of those questions are still unresolved, and yet there seems to be very little attention being paid to it. Senator Paul has been following this from the beginning. He continues to follow when a lot of other people seem to have the idea that this is all in the past. We don't need to find out. And we sat down with him just a bit ago to talk about some of the pending issues, some of the questions that still are unanswered with regard to Dr. Fauci and his associates, as well as what the future might hold when it comes to funding this very dangerous gain-of-function research. Here is the interview we had with Dr. Paul. Senator, it's great to have you back on the show. We appreciate your time. Let me begin with an exchange you had in the Senate this week where you, in an extremely factual way, almost without any assertions of any kind, just reading documents and laying out the timeline of what happened that led up to this journalistic and scientific scandal where they published this Lancet article proclaiming to be certain about the origins of COVID, when in fact, not only were they uncertain, but what they were getting secretly was information that was contrary to what they were claiming, namely that it was far more likely a lab leak. And then on top of that, the last time you were on the show a couple weeks ago, we talked about these emails showing that they purposely deleted emails in order to make sure they couldn't be obtainable by FOIA, which is a classic cover-up. In the past, when you've had major events in American political life, like the JFK assassination or the 9/11 attack, even January 6th, which pales in comparison to the impact of the COVID pandemic, we've created these kind of bipartisan blue ribbon commissions of all the wise men and women in Washington who were bipartisan, and they would issue a comprehensive report that would be the trusted, definitive account of what happened. That was at least the theory. And what strikes me so much is, despite the fact that you can make the case that COVID is the most significant event in our lifetime, we've never had any commission like that. And there's actually seems to be very little interest, even in Congress and both parties, very little push to have a comprehensive accounting of what was done here, what was said here, and what happened. Why do you think that is?
You know, as a journalist, you can recall how curious people are, particularly when journalists think they're being lied to or that there's a cover-up. When a government official says, I've deleted all the earlier emails, I think we're safe now, you would think that that would excite journalists across the spectrum, and they would be scouring and going after every tidbit. You know, that was the senior advisor to Anthony Fauci who said that. You know, I've deleted all the emails. I've been taught by the FOIA lady how to do it. They started changing the spelling, and we actually are now refiling all these FOIA, because if you take the words eco-health and you replace the vowels with numbers, it doesn't show up in FOIA. Christian Anderson, one of the acolytes or disciples of Fauci, one of the virologists who wrote the paper saying there's no way this could have come from the lab while privately saying it came from the lab, they began to misspell his name with $signs in the place of the vowels. Now, there's a certain irony in that, since he got a $9 million grant shortly after he published this paper saying it couldn't have come from the lab. But this is the kind of thing that you would think this would excite people on both sides of the aisle. When the House committee brought in that senior assistant to Fauci, they did grill him pretty well. But he also alleged that he thought Fauci had deleted his emails. He said that he could take private messages to Fauci and call him on the phone, and that Fauci was smart enough to not put this stuff in writing. And yet, nobody's really gone after Fauci. The Democrats still are in love with him. Nobody's subpoenaed his private emails or his private phone records. And these are things I would have done immediately. I would have given him 2 weeks to comply, and I would have subpoenaed him, because it takes a while to go through court to enforce a subpoena. But I think they've let him get away with it, and Democrats continue to defend him, even though I think really philosophically he was a driving force behind letting gain-of-function research go on that led to this disaster.
So we're going to put that video, that exchange where you go through these events, into this interview.
Today we are here to examine one of the most critical and debated questions of our time. Did COVID-19 originate in a lab? To answer this question, let's revisit the early days of the pandemic and examine what some of Dr. Anthony Fauci's inner circle said privately about the origins of the virus. Discussions that were only revealed through FOIA litigation. Christian Anderson wrote, "The lab escape version of this is so friggin' likely to have happened because they were already doing this type of work, and the molecular data is fully consistent with that scenario." Ian Lipkin stressed the nightmare of circumstantial evidence to assess regarding the possibility of inadvertent release, given the scale of bat coronavirus research pursued in Wuhan. Bob Gary said, "I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you get from the bat virus, or one very similar to it, to COVID-19, where you insert exactly 4 amino acids, 12 nucleotides, and all have to be added at the exact same time to gain this function. I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature." According to Gary, it's not crackpot to suggest this could have happened, given the gain-of-function research we know was happening at Wuhan. These are all private statements, which you'll discover today differ greatly from their public statements. Even Ralph Barrick, world-famous gain-of-function researcher and collaborator with Wuhan's Dr. Shi, admitted, so they, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, have a very large collection of viruses in their laboratory. And so it's, proximity is a problem. It's a problem. Federal court orders reveal that even Dr. Fauci himself privately acknowledged concerns about gain-of-function research in Wuhan and mutations in the virus that suggest it might have been engineered, just days before he commissioned the proximal origin paper. Despite these private doubts, publicly these so-called experts and their allies were dismissing the lab leak theory as a conspiracy. Within days, Anderson, Lipkin, and Gary were putting final touches on what would be remembered as one of the most remarkable reversals in modern history. In their proximal origin paper, these scientists concluded, "We do not believe that any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible." Privately, they were saying one thing. Publicly, they were saying another. Media pundits parroted the narrative, while social media platforms censored discussion about the lab leak, labeling it as misinformation and stifling open discourse about the virus's origins.
Have several criminal referrals that you've made to the Department of Justice regarding Dr. Fauci and his associates deliberately deleting emails about major government policy to evade FOIA, or using things like $signs and characters to ensure they're not detected. Those are absolutely criminal acts. We've had major political scandals over attempts to conceal emails in the past from the public, including the Hillary Clinton private server at her home, but others as well. This is on a much larger scale. And then you have the question of whether Dr. Fauci and other scientists violated gain-of-function limitations and limits in everything that happened here, and whether he's lied to Congress about it. Why do you think criminal investigations from the Department of Justice are warranted, and why do you think Merrick Garland is essentially ignoring them?
Well, lying to Congress is a felony, but also destroying evidence is a felony as well. So I think both of those are significant and severe crimes. It's against the law to try to avoid FOIA and to not use your government email. It's not clear that that's a felony, and it's not clear that it's very enforceable. And that's why people keep doing it. There have been various politicians accused of using private email through time. But I do think that the only way you'd get to the bottom of this would be, for example, David Morenz has admitted to most of these things. He actually didn't admit, we found it through FOIA, that he was doing these things. But I would bring him back in for testimony, because after his testimony, they brought in Anthony Fauci, who basically threw his 20-year acquaintance under the bus and said, hardly knew the guy, never brought him into any meetings. He didn't attend policy meetings. His office was in another building. And by golly, it sounds like he was not adhering to a policy line. I'd bring Morenz back in and ask him again, now that he's heard Anthony Fauci's description of him and his testimony, whether he wants to add anything, because the human element is he may well want to, have a more complete testimony after he hears Fauci throwing under the bus. But really, typically in things like this, you get more information if someone who's committed malfeasance is indicted and there's someone above them. They often will testify further in order for some leniency. So I would have hoped that he would have been prosecuted by now, or at least indicted. I think the FOIA lady, I reserve judgment over whether she should be indicted, but they are going to take her testimony. The problem with all of this is, and this is what makes a lot of Americans unhappy, is nobody believes Merrick Garland will indict someone, because these are, Anthony Fauci is the love of the Democrat Party. He's the paragon of government medicine. He's a paragon of government, centralized government authority over your medical decision-making process. And nobody believes that he'll ever be, investigated or indicted by this administration. And that's a bad thing, that if we're voting for administrations based on who they're going to prosecute. And that's a world we don't want to live in, but I think that's the world that's coming.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. He himself equated himself and his pronouncements to science, so that if you criticize Dr. Fauci, you're automatically anti-scientific. That seems to be embedded in a lot of liberal discourse and a lot of liberal mentality. And by liberal, I mean establishment liberal institutions, that there should be no criticism or questioning or accountability for Dr. Fauci, because he is the science. And so any attempt to investigate him is basically to undermine science. So let me ask you about that. Well, last time you were here, one of the things we discussed was the issue of gain of function research, which is when scientists take a certain virus or pathogen and manipulate it in a lab to make it either more contagious for humans or more fatal or dangerous for humans, or both, presumably to engage in research about these viruses. And of course, we talked about the justification, which is that, they have to do that in the event that something like this arrives. They need to be able to study these more dangerous and more contagious pathogens to figure out defenses against them. But obviously, COVID-19 showed us how dangerous this research can be, and it's been known in science for a long time how ethically questionable it is, and yet now it seems like there's almost a bipartisan movement in Washington to even go further and give this kind of research more authorization legally and even financially. What is happening in terms of the debate in Congress over what to do with gain-of-function research?
I think I think nobody's saying any longer that we should do nothing. So I think everybody's acknowledging something needs to be done. The Biden administration has put forward some self-regulations, self-guidances from the administration. This is sort of like, the foxes, guarding the hen house, letting the people who've been committing the errors make the regulatory changes. What we found out in the committee hearing is that even despite the new guidances from Biden's administration to try to prevent this from happening, 3 scientists from MIT decided to discover whether the guidance would work. And so they went online and ordered the fragments of DNA and RNA to construct the Spanish flu. And they were able to order it online. Despite the attempt by the Biden administration to stop this from happening, they went to different companies, ordered different fragments, put it together in a lab, and then they warned the FBI they were doing this so they wouldn't go to jail for creating a biological weapon. And they didn't create the actual infectious portion. There's two strands of RNA and DNA. One can lead to the infectious, the other one doesn't. They created the non-infectious part of the DNA or RNA for this. and just to prove that it could be done. I think that's enough evidence that just letting the administration do this isn't enough. So we have legislation to create an independent committee. It'll still be appointed by the president because someone's got to appoint these people. It'll be scientists, but they will not be scientists who either receive grants for this or dispense grants. They can't be in the grant-making process because I think that once the money touches your hands, it gives you such a conflict that it makes it hard. If you're receiving $9 million, can you really be trusted to be objective? Even if you're trying to be objective, but you get money from these people, you tend to want to please the people giving the money. And so it needs to be outside of NIH. NIH has also resisted giving us information over the deliberations over what is gain of function. So they just really have proven themselves not to be trusted. And this power needs to be taken away from them. We also are concerned about classified research. They've been so resistant to giving us non-classified. All the COVID stuff is non-classified. It's supposedly not a weapon or developed as a weapon in our country. And so that stuff, they're not giving it to us. We wonder what they're doing in the classified world, which is a world in which our intel agencies routinely ignore our requests. So if I write a request, like I want to meet with the scientists at the CIA who looked at the evidence to discover whether COVID's from a lab or from nature, and I want to meet with them, they just say no. So that it essentially means there is no oversight. Now we have a whistleblower from the CIA that says that the scientists at the CIA voted 6-1 to say that the virus came from the lab, but then they were overruled by 2 superiors. I want to see the arguments. I don't want to see who the people are, if they have intelligence came from a specific operative that would be endangered. I don't need to see any of that. I want to see the scientific arguments that were presented before the committee. I want to know why, if they voted 6-1 to say it came from the lab, they were overruled by superiors. Did it have something to do with, we don't want to disrupt relations with China? And look, I don't want to divorce ourselves from China. I think trade with China is still good, and we need to still have trade with China. And it'd be crazy to have an embargo on China. But at the same time, I don't worry about the trade so much that I'm willing to obscure the truth. I really want to know what happened here so we can fix it. And that's the level of things. But our committee that we're forming will be independent. We'll be able to look at all unclassified research, but also classified as well. And I think this will provide oversight like we've never had before.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about the amazing historical truth that when the anthrax attacks happened in 2001, October 2001, we were told, wow, this is some of the most sophisticated and weaponized and manipulated anthrax strains we have ever seen. The way in which they spread and are so fatal means that some evil people like Saddam Hussein manipulated them in a lab. And of course, it turned out that it, in fact, according to the FBI itself, came from our own labs, our own military facilities in Fort Detrick under a classified program. So it's hard to believe that at least some of that isn't still taking place. Now, let me ask you just about the debate over gain-of-function research, because the dangers of gain-of-function research are obvious. Last time when you were here, we talked about the arguments in favor of them. So I can understand how reasonable people, including scientists, might think that gain-of-function research in very limited and safe environments might be justifiable. At the same time, I'm not saying that's my view. I'm saying I can understand how someone might see it. At the same time, there was this issue of dog experiments that Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene raised when Anthony Fauci was before the House. And because it was her who raised it, media outlets were ready to say, oh, this is insane, this is disinformation. And even the Washington Post fact checker went and said, I assumed when I went to go fact check this that of course it would be crazy because it came from her. But as it turns out, it's a lot more complicated. There are actual hideous and seemingly unnecessary dog experiments taking place. And then we did some of our own reporting. We had Leighton Woodhouse, who does a lot of reporting on this. And one of the things he said was, not only are these dog experiments that are incredibly torturous for dogs, unnecessary medically, a lot of times what they'll do is say, let's see what happens if we put bleach or other viruses inside dogs, and then we'll just monitor them for 8 weeks. And then they do it, and they want more funding, and the next year they say, let's just put a little bit more bleach or viruses inside the dog. So they change it just a little bit. I wonder if you think that there's something in science where there's this sort of instinct to want to understand or discover things simply for their own sake, while disregarding any ethical considerations or pragmatic dangers that research might entail? Do you think science has kind of gotten out of whack in terms of weighing not just the benefits of research, but also the costs and dangers of it?
We know there's money changing hands. They get paid each time, and it's not a small amount of money. I mean, these aren't disinterested people, living like Mother Teresa and helping the poor. These are people that are very wealthy, making hundreds of thousands of dollars individually and having labs that have millions of dollars. But I will tell you, people's sensibilities change over time. So, for example, when I was in medical school, we watched old video, black and white, and it was gruesome, of what they would do to chimpanzees in simulated car accidents and brain injuries. And nobody believes in that. I mean, we all have decided that primates are close enough to us that we have really decided, and plus we have enough humans crashing their heads into brick walls that we can study the humans who die from these things, that we don't need to do this to chimpanzees, and we don't do it anymore. Same with dogs, too. And we've decided some of this stuff is too heinous. But some of it goes on, and this is consistent with Fauci's theory that the knowledge is worth the risk of a pandemic, but it's also worth, if we have to torture a few animals, the knowledge is worth it. So there was a research project in Tunisia, and in this research project, they were sewing the eyelids open and infesting their eyes with sand fleas. And in some of these experiments, that it was annoying to the researchers that the dogs would cry so much, so they removed their larynx so you couldn't hear them. Now, the paper was produced, and this is without question produced, and it has an NIAID number. This is from Anthony Fauci's thing, has the number where they get the money. As soon as the hue and cry came out, they looked at it and they said, lo and behold, our lab got money from NIAID, but we didn't use any of that money on this research. Mm-hmm. We all used it on this other benign research where we didn't torture the dogs. And so do I think those people are lying? Without question, they're lying. They're lying to absolve themselves. They still did the research. They say, no, we got the money from Egypt for that, or we got the money from Tunisia for that. And then the U.S. money we only use for wholesome purposes. And no, and I've never really been involved in the animal rights stuff before, but I'm appalled by some of this stuff and have become a little bit involved in the sense that we shouldn't do needless things. And we were actually able to pass legislation that some animal wellness groups brought me and said that it was a requirement from the 30s that every drug had to have animal testing. And we simply changed the rule to say that it's not mandatory, that if you can find a way of doing the test equivalent. And really, sometimes it turns out that animal testing is completely different than humans, that you test something in animals that looks very dangerous that's in humans and vice versa. And this doesn't ban animal testing, but the companies try to approve some of the drugs without using animals, which I think is a good step forward.
Yeah, I think that's what people's ethical sense are, is if it's absolutely necessary, you can do it ethically, but not if it doesn't have necessity. Just a couple more questions. I want to focus in on the financial incentives that you mentioned in connection with this kind of dog research, but in another context, which is, I think that at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of license given to health policy professionals like Dr. Fauci and others, because the idea was, it's a novel coronavirus, people don't know much about it, they're entitled to make mistakes, to shift their science. I think most people thought that was reasonable, but in retrospect, a lot of what was done that has become most controversial, including attempting to ban discussion of the lab leak, wasn't just this kind of good faith, earnest mistakes that were being made about this new science, but had all kinds of financial and political incentives, specifically with regard to banning people from raising the question of whether this might have escaped from the Wuhan lab. Can you talk about the financial motives that were obviously a part of and likely motivated this attempt by Fauci and his associates to ban any questioning of whether it came from the Wuhan lab?
Well, for years, the way to get more money, research is so there's been a lot of scare talk about and warnings of pandemic coming. And so a lot of money has been spent, hundreds of millions of dollars, probably a million themselves. But in the wake of this, when the paper Anderson and Bob Gary wrote, Christian Anderson got a $9 million personal contract with the NIH 2 months after he wrote the letter saying no way this could have come from the lab. So on the one hand, I think there's an enhancement in a scare scariness that is promoted to get. But on the other hand, they want to make sure that the scariness is coming from nature, not from their research. And the examples of things leaking are just plentiful. So, for example, SARS-1 came from animals. We discovered it was civet cats, and it died out because it wasn't very contagious. It was contagious in animals, but not humans. But as it died out, it actually came back into being 6 more times from the lab. They traced 6 more outbreaks from the lab. Allison Young has written a book on this, and she lists thousands of accidents. Ralph Barrick at UNC, who is said to be one of the more careful researchers and has one of the safest labs, has had a mouse escape his lab. And so throughout, I mean, there are accidents happening. I mean, I think Robert Redfield closed down Fort Detrick for a couple of months because there was something going on there that he was worried about. I don't think it was ever exactly revealed what was going on, but they were worried about safety. And so, yeah, money is a big deal in this. Money, that's why even the hysteria, you have to base that on the, how much money is coming to these people, the more hysteria they create. And then also how much of the risk is actually from nature and how much is from a lab. The good thing about nature that everybody needs to know, and this is why I try not to scare people about avian flu, is that avian flu is very, very deadly, but not very infectious in humans. So occasionally we're getting a human that gets this, but there's almost no reports of human-to-human transmission. Now, one way it could be adapted is in the lab. If you take avian flu and you keep running it through a human cell line, like a humanized mouse, you can run an avian flu 20 times and all of a sudden you got a virus coming out the other end that is actually a virus that now could infect humans. That is a real danger if we modify it in the lab. Much more, and with animals, there's not a lot what we can do other than monitor the animals, which I think is a reasonable thing. Surveillance, you monitor the animals, and you could also check what you find. As long as you're not changing that virus, you could take that virus and then see if it infects mammals, to see how it's doing and see what the dangers are. But I wouldn't change that virus or try to mutate it to make it more transmissible among humans.
Yeah, and of course, I think the scandal of the Lancet article was that so many people who likely had a connection to the Wuhan lab ended up being the arbiters about whether that Wuhan lab and the funding in which they were involved was what led to the COVID pandemic. And shockingly, they concluded, oh no, that what we did had nothing to do with the COVID pandemic. The Wuhan lab had nothing to do with it. It came from nature. Just a standard conflict of interest that to this day has never really been held accountable. Let me, as a final question, ask you this. There was a Reuters investigation, quite good journalism, I would say, that uncovered and revealed this online clandestine Pentagon campaign using very similar tactics that we claim the Russians used in 2016, fake Facebook pages and online fake Twitter accounts and bots and the like, in order to spread disinformation about the Chinese vaccine, trying to convince very poor countries who couldn't get the vaccine except from China that was giving it to free, that they should have doubts about the vaccine, about its efficacy, about its safety. Now, obviously, a lot of people have doubts like that about all vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine, all Moderna, et cetera. But the position of the U.S. government at the time was that it's essentially criminal to foster doubts or hesitancy, let alone anti-vax messaging about the vaccine, because people who do that are killing people, are causing the deaths of other people. People in the United States were forced to take the vaccine upon pain of losing their jobs or freedom of movement. Obviously, people who questioned the vaccine were censored from big tech for a long time. And yet at the exact same time, the U.S. government was in the poorest countries in the world, like the Philippines and places in the Middle East, scaring people about taking the only vaccine they could get, which was the Chinese vaccine, not because they were really concerned about the China vaccine, but because they wanted to prevent China from gaining a sort of PR victory in these countries by being the ones to offer the vaccine to these people who couldn't get it elsewhere. What do you make of this sort of obvious conflict between the public posture of the U.S. government and what they were doing in secret to spread what you could only really call anti-vax messaging?
I guess it doesn't surprise me that the government is dishonest. When they start talking about misinformation and they're worried about politicians or people on the right or left spreading misinformation, I remind people that the greatest purveyor of misinformation in the history of time has been governments. And so it doesn't surprise me. But when it's recounted that they're casting doubt on a Chinese vaccine versus ours, my first question is, who benefits? Well, it sounds like Moderna and Pfizer might benefit if people use less Chinese vaccine. Maybe they use more American pharmaceutical vaccine. And so it worries me that billions of dollars are being made here. And I remember the manufacturers coming here and whining as the virus was getting less dangerous and nobody was paying attention to vaccinating their kids for COVID because no kids were dying from this. And it's like, what can we do? What can we do? And everybody's wringing their hands that profit's going down. And look, I'm all for profit. I'm for capitalism, but I'm not for the government mandating someone's profit. But I would worry that some of this might have been done at the behest of American pharmaceutical companies, and it should be investigated. It also could just be nationalism. There's a lot of, I think, crazy, overzealous nationalism. But you think your nationalism wouldn't be, if the vaccine really is effective and that's what it's showing, that you'd wish that the elderly in Indonesia or the Philippines would die with no vaccine. So let's hope it wasn't that. But it seems like a really less than moral or less than hopefully an American standard would be to actually be against a vaccine that might be saving lives. And the Chinese vaccine, I think a lot of them are sort of killed vaccines the way we have made vaccines traditionally in this country. And like all the coronavirus vaccines, they have deficiencies because the virus evolves and they aren't as effective over time. But I think they're about the same as ours. There was some reduction in severe disease and death in the very vulnerable.
Well, I wish I could say I was shocked, and I guess I can't, but I definitely am outraged at how little interest there is in digging into all these things that happened with respect to the COVID vaccine, the restrictions on our discourse, the banning of questions about the origin. I'm very glad that you're there being so relentless about trying to uncover this. I think that should be the role of journalists as well, even though in the United States these days, less and less it seems to be. But I have no doubt that you'll continue to do that work. I'm very appreciative of that, as well as the time you took to talk to us about that this evening. Thanks so much, and have a good day. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.